children will rise up because you are going to rise up and fight with me.
Tonight, a push for parent empowerment.
It's only about their interest. It's not in the interest of children in Texas.
Why some Texans are torn over so-called school choice as the state's top Republican leaders make their fiercest push yet. Plus, Cornyn's congressional influence.
He also is a very, very assertive legislator.
How reaching across the political aisle is landing the Texas senator praise and in hot water. And later, all eyes on a New York City grand jury. Texas Republicans react to a possible impending indictment against former President Donald Trump. Capitol Tonight starts right now.
We're going to show up, we're going to show out, and we're going to show the legislature exactly why it is so important that we empower parents to choose the education that's best for their child.
That's Governor Greg Abbott at the Texas Capitol today. He spoke to around 200 Texans about education freedom and the need for a so-called school choice program in Texas. He and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick have promised Texans for months that lawmakers will pass a voucher program this legislative session. But as our Charlotte Scott reports, it could still be a tough sell even with new protections for rural districts.
We will not let a little rain dampen our spirits.
Texans braved the rain Tuesday to rally outside the Texas Capitol. They're here to support lawmakers passing a school choice program. It would give parents the ability to take tax dollars away from public schools to use for private and charter ones.
We need to empower parents to be able to fight for their kids to achieve the best result for their kids.
Houston area Senator Brandon Creighton filed a bill to create education savings accounts to disperse up to $8,000 tax dollars per student. He says the state has enough money to fund both public schools and ESAs.
These are separate tranches of state-related dollars, separate from public education. And as we lift up public schools and teachers like never before, we'll also have other funding initiatives like the Education Savings Account.
That is very problematic that we're hearing that we can fund both when there has been systematically a denial to adequately fund schools in Texas.
Democrats and rural Republicans, whose regions often lack private schools, have long opposed vouchers. So in an attempt to try to woo them, Senator Creighton included in his bill a carve-out for districts with fewer than 20,000 students. The state would give those schools $10,000 for each student who leaves for a private school, but that only applies for 2 years.
I think this is just an attempt to persuade rural Republicans who have not supported vouchers, but it's a really poor attempt because after a few years goes by, the funding is going to disappear. And so all it is, it's actually an acknowledgement that vouchers takes money out of public schools.
But to all the Texans who do support school choice, Governor Abbott left them with a call to action.
You need to call your state representative, your state senator, and let them know you support school choice in the state of Texas.
For Capitol Tonight, I'm Charlotte Scott.
And as we reported yesterday, Attorney General Ken Paxton issued a legal opinion determining education savings accounts do not violate the state's constitution. He noted it does not prohibit the legislature from establishing an ESA program so long as it is not funded by the Permanent School Fund or Available School Fund. The first public hearing on Senator Creighton's bill is scheduled for tomorrow. We want to bring in Senator Mays Middleton now. He's a Republican who represents the Galveston area and is a co-author of Creighton's bill. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me on tonight.
Our pleasure. One thing we heard from some of the parents today at this rally is that they're hoping that this money would go to children already in some of these programs, but I know that the bill would only go to new students going into private education in private schools. What's your response to some of those parents?
Well, Senate Bill 8 qualifies every child in public school right now, and that would be one of the most expansive school choice bills passed in America ever. So there are 31 states that have done some form of school choice, but this bill is very expansive. There's 5.4 million kids in public school right now, so they would be qualified under this bill, and it is a huge step forward for parental rights and providing parents the tools that they need to meet their child's unique educational needs.
Do you foresee any exceptions for people that already have kids in private school getting some of this money?
So one of the things in the bill is there's a keep whole provision for rural school districts. Now that's not a carve out But what that means is as students leave in the rural areas, there's approximately $10,000 that's available to go to those districts to meet fixed costs and other costs that they have. But at the end of the day, 100% of public school students remain 100% funded under the bill.
Yeah, I mean, with that Republican or the rural areas and getting some of that money for the kids that leave the public schools, I mean, how much of that are you hearing from some of these rural Republican lawmakers who have been so hesitant about school vouchers, school choice, in trying to get this over the finish line? What are you hearing from them?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the biggest opponents to educational choice is taxpayer-funded lobbyists. So parents' own property tax dollars are being used on Austin lobbyists that then go lobby against what parents want. So we'll see them tomorrow in the committee. It will be loaded down with taxpayer-funded lobbyists. So you're going to have parents there that are there because they believe in this and they want more tools on the table for their child. They want to be able to decide which type of education works best for their child's unique needs. And unfortunately, there's going to be lobbyists that are coming right after them that are paid for it with their property tax dollars. But you know, at the end of the day, I hear from parents all over the state that support this. You know, parents don't think of themselves as Panhandle parents or Gulf Coast parents or Piney Woods of East Texas parents or urban parents or rural parents. They just think of themselves as parents and they want more tools on the table for their child.
We just heard this from one of the people in the story, but a lot of some of the rural Republicans too that we've talked to, and some of the people that are still skeptical about this say that it's, you know, they're concerned about funneling money away from public schools, and even with the rural districts getting that extra money, is that admitting that this is funneling money away from public schools?
No, this is just a key poll. Like 100% of public school students are 100% funded. And this actually increases the per capita funding for our rural school districts where, you know, there are less students and it is not a carve out. We are qualifying every current public school student in rural Texas and letting the parents decide what's best for their child's unique needs. And look, this is a tide that's going to lift all boats. You know, I have a story, very personal story at Upward Hope Academy in Galveston. And you know what that is? That is a school for low-income students that are dropouts or soon-to-be dropouts from Ball High School. And these are students that wouldn't graduate, and it gives them a chance. And nearly 100% of the students at Upward Hope Academy graduate, and they have a degree, and they go on to be successful. And what we're going to do with this educational choice program, we're going to allow more Upward Hope Academies to start to provide that hope to people that are not able to have that right now.
We just have 30 seconds left, but I can't let you leave without asking you about accountability. And that's another thing that's mentioned a lot of times of just private schools aren't held to the same accountability and the same standards as public schools in terms of testing and all of those things. So what's your response there?
There is accountability in the bill. So it's administered by the Comptroller's Office, and it's financial fraud accountability to make sure that those educational expenses are going to actual education-related activities. So there is that check and balance to make sure that there's not any type of financial fraud with the system. But at the end of the day, we don't need to be deciding for parents what type of education they choose for their child. It needs to be flexible, and they need to be able to make the decisions, whether that's tutoring or educational therapies or various other options that are available under Senate Bill 8, and let the parents decide, of course, with the check and balance to make sure that the funding is not used on expenses outside of educational related purposes.
Senator, I know that you've got legislation pushing even more of this too, and we'll be watching that hearing tomorrow. We'll get you back on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me tonight. I appreciate it.
A pleasure.
Yeah.
Texas lawmakers are also zeroing in on gun safety in the wake of the Uvalde mass shooting. A new state House committee tasked with handling such bills met for the first time today. Lawmakers heard testimony on 14 firearm measures, including one that would expand safe gun storage education. Another would close a loophole for gun background checks for juveniles. And lawmakers debated a bill that would mean if you can't legally buy a gun, you can't get the magazines to go with it.
If we can require verification when someone buys spray paint or Sudafed because we're worried they might huff fumes or make meth, we can absolutely do that for firearm magazines.
The committee includes members from areas affected by mass shootings. Lawmakers heard hours of testimony from gun rights groups and those pushing for more gun restrictions. Turning now to Washington, a new report this week ranks the effectiveness of individual members of Congress. It turns out a Texas Republican known for reaching across the aisle is one of those at the top of the list. Our Washington reporter Rena Diamante takes a closer look.
My name is Dr. Roy A. Guerrero.
When President Joe Biden and some residents of Uvalde, Texas, gathered at the White House to celebrate passage of the first gun safety law in nearly 30 years, Republican Senator John Cornyn joined them too. Cornyn was a lead negotiator of that legislation and several other bipartisan bills that were passed in the last Congress.
He put forward 102 bills. 23 of those directly passed the Senate, 15 became law. And for, average senators, it's more like 2 become law.
Cornyn scored as the most effective Republican senator in a new study released this week by the Center for Effective Lawmaking. The joint initiative by the University of Virginia and Vanderbilt University considered over a dozen factors, including committee votes and legislative significance in ranking the effectiveness of each senator and representative. Cornyn, who has been in Congress since 2002, was ranked the second most effective senator overall, behind Democrat Gary Peters of Michigan.
The idea that the minority party members, if they're working hard and finding ideas that resonate with both parties, can get a lot done is a different perspective on how Congress works.
Republican strategist Hans Klingler, who has worked for Texans in Congress, says he's not surprised by Cornyn's high ranking.
Texas has been very blessed for many, many, many decades to have legislators from both parties who do not view compromise as a dirty word.
Compromise, though, has not always been welcomed by members of his own party. Cornyn was booed at the Texas GOP convention last summer for his role in the gun safety law negotiations. Cornyn reportedly responded that he's never given in to mobs.
Very rarely does the attitude or mood on the floor of the Republican state convention necessarily dictate how an election is going to go.
Senator Cornyn was not available for an interview, but in a statement said, despite the partisanship that gripped the chamber last year, he said we managed to accomplish quite a bit on behalf of the American people. The senior senator from Texas is up for re-election in 2026. In Washington, Rena Diamante, Capitol Tonight.
President Biden declared a piece of West Texas desert to be a national monument today. Advocates have been pushing for more than 50 years to protect the Casna Range in El Paso. The designation of the more than 6,600 acres of land on Fort Bliss will help preserve and remediate it in order to expand public access to the space. According to the White House, it will be placed under the control of the U.S. Army. Still to come on Capitol Tonight, division over drag shows, why a Texas University president canceled a student-led event. Welcome back to Capitol Tonight. Let's get a check now of some of the other political stories making headlines across Texas. The president of West Texas A&M University canceled a student drag show, arguing it degrades women. Students and First Amendment attorneys reject that idea and say his move violates free speech rights. The decision to cancel the campus event comes as Republican Texas lawmakers push bills that would regulate or restrict drag shows. State lawmakers are moving forward on plans to transform Texas's crumbling water infrastructure. A Senate panel advanced legislation that would create a new water fund to pay for new projects and upgraded infrastructure. The focus would be on rural communities, and advocacy groups are hoping the fund will be at least $3 billion. The plan would require voter approval. And a proposal to extend Medicaid coverage for new moms to 12 months after birth unanimously passed out of a House committee today. The House approved a similar measure last session, but the Senate knocked it down to 6 months. Advocates say the full year of coverage is critical to prevent maternal deaths and help Texans treat health issues identified during pregnancy. Let's bring in our political analysts now. Joining us this evening, Ted DeLisi, Republican Ted DeLisi, and Democrat Manny Garcia. Good to see you both.
Good to be here.
Ted, I want to start with the Medicaid coverage for new moms. I mean, this pushes for longer postpartum coverage, and it comes as the end of COVID protections that had kind of kept that going are set to end. What are the chances the Senate backs this 12 months this session?
You know, one of the indications of the seriousness of this bill is the lieutenant governor giving it a low bill number, which signifies that Democrat Tony Rose from Dallas was the sponsor of this. I think the fact that it came out of committee with unanimously with both parties, I think signifies that the House is very serious about this. And Karina, what I've always said is that when the House really wants something, the Senate knows that it really wants something. So it is always part of the conversation, but I do think that this bill makes it to the governor's desk this session.
Yeah, I mean, the speaker making this a main priority. I mean, Manny, what do you think this would mean in terms of for Texans, for new moms, but also just the chances that you think it has to pass?
You know, according to the state's own panel in 2019, 184 children lost their mothers to pregnancy-related death. 90% of those deaths could have been prevented. So this is the kind of coverage that's going to help get those numbers down. It's going to help protect those mothers. The House overwhelmingly supported it before. The Senate now has the choice to make. It's either 60 days of coverage or a full year of coverage. I think eventually, like Ted said, they're going to end up doing the right thing. I think they're going to end up supporting full year.
I mean, of course, they could come to a compromise between 60 days and a year. I mean, we should say that. Yeah. But I think as it is now, I think their momentum is there for a year.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the 60 days because that's technically what it still is right now, because there's been some federal involvement here too, so they haven't signed off on getting it to the even 6 months. Yeah. We'll see how all of that plays out. I do want to turn to vouchers, the education savings account, this proposal from Senator Brandon Creighton that will be heard in committee tomorrow for the first time. I mean, Ted, how could this approach and the giving rural districts these payments, these $10,000 payments if the kid goes to a private school, how do you think that could change the outcome of this legislation that has so long been pushed back on?
You know, I've been watching this debate for 2 decades in town, and I have to say this, I think a couple of things have changed. The first of all is that we've never had the type of advocacy. The advocates for ESAs, as they're called, educational savings accounts, have never had the type of direct advocacy for the governor that they have this session. The lieutenant governor spent, I think, 4.5 minutes in his inaugural address talking about this issue. And so we're going to sort of start to see what things look like. But I think that Senator Creighton has done an extremely shrewd thing, because many of the detractors of so-called school choice or educational savings account come from rural Texas. If you tell these rural school districts you're going to be held harmless, not just held harmless, I think they're financially benefit at $10,000 per kid, I think it actually takes one of the extremely sharp sticks off the table and gives the bill a much better chance to pass.
I mean, we're still hearing skepticism from rural lawmakers. I know Democrats are not on board. I mean, what's your response to, you know, what Ted's saying, but also the bill and what we heard from Senator Middleton?
Well, to Ted's point, certainly the governor has become more vocal about this, and the lieutenant governor has become more vocal about this. The other thing that's changed is corporate private schools are spending a lot of money on really good lobbyists to talk about this. And the governor was maybe able to marshal a couple dozen folks out to the Capitol today. Well, last week, Texas teachers, Texas AFT, had over 500 folks talking about this and talking about the respect that they need and the real problems that need to be solved in our public schools. I think fundamentally the politics have not changed. Republicans now acknowledge that if you pass private school vouchers, it's going to steal taxpayer dollars away from neighborhood public schools, and that's why they're trying to build this into the system to try to hold that away. But 2 years is no guarantee at all for these Republican lawmakers when the school district is often the biggest employer in these rural places. You can't tear apart that fabric.
Yeah, I mean, Ted, I'll let you respond, but just in terms of
I think there's a couple of interesting things.
I mean,
the first thing I think is interesting about tomorrow's hearing is that it's going to start with a teacher bill of rights, and it's going to start with a conversation about historic increases in teacher pay. That's going to be an interesting start to the hearing tomorrow. I think it could go till very late in the evening, because I think the advocates against, or the advocates for, and the detractors will both show up in force tomorrow, I'm expecting. And so, but look, I think you have to say this, you know, both sides, the governor's had big rallies, everyone sort of had big rallies. This is probably, I mean, Manny, am I wrong? Is this the highest profile bill this session?
Yeah, probably.
I think this is probably the highest profile bill this session. I expect both sides to come out, but I think there's more momentum behind this than I've ever seen before.
Manny, really quickly, I mean, just in terms of, we're hearing it in the Senate, I mean, what do you think about hearing this in the House?
Well, that's where it's going to have a rough road.
Yeah.
That's where we're really going to see these different factions come out. The House has been much more willing to not toe party line, to not toe whatever the leadership dictates, and they're going to listen to their constituents because they're closer to their folks at home. And when high school football coaches are saying, don't do this, it's going to tear apart Friday Night Lights, maybe I think some folks are going to listen.
I'll say this,
Manny,
Chairman.
Ted, I'm going to have to stop you there, but thank you guys. Still to come on Capitol tonight, all eyes on Manhattan, how the Big Apple is preparing for crowds and protests if an indictment comes down for former President Trump. Former President Trump is waiting to see if an indictment will come down from a Manhattan prosecutor. New York police are preparing for possible protests and setting up barriers around the district attorney's office. Today was the day Trump predicted he'd be arrested. He made that allegation on social media over the weekend. Texas lawmakers are denouncing the possible indictment on Twitter. Senator Ted Cruz called the case against Trump, quote, obviously political retribution and political persecution. But during his podcast, Cruz also called it a gift to Trump's 2024 campaign. Cruz is one of at least 7 Republican members of Congress that voiced support for Trump on social media Monday. Stay the course or take a pause? That's the question the Federal Reserve will ponder as it makes its next decision on rate hikes. The Fed kicked off a 2-day meeting today, and the announcement will come tomorrow afternoon. Karen Kaifa is in Washington to break it down.
The Federal Reserve sees inflation easing, but a shaky banking sector, making their decision on interest rates more complicated.
I think what matters is, can they stabilize the banking system so they can free up their ability to tackle inflation?
Since last March, the Fed has pushed interest rates higher to make borrowing more expensive and cool spending. Annual inflation was down to 6% in February from a 40-year high of 9.1% last June. The Fed's target inflation rate is 2%. The labor market remains strong, keeping labor costs high for companies. So these economic indicators would typically point to another rate increase Wednesday.
Taken in isolation, I mean, the economy looks very, very good right now. And yes, the Fed would probably be raising rates by 25 basis points without what's going on right now. That said, what's going on right now is very unsettling.
But the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank collapses raise questions about what banks can handle, with higher interest rates pushing down the value of bonds they purchased when rates were low. Professor Valentina Bruno of American University says the Fed has little room for miscalculation.
If the Fed hit the brakes too hard, it could be the beginning of a slowdown or even worse, a painful recession. And if the Fed hit the brakes too little, then inflation may go out of control.
The recent rate hikes put pressure on consumers from both sides, still facing high inflation at the grocery store and elsewhere, while paying more in credit card interest on mortgages and auto loans. In Washington, I'm Karen Kaifa.
And that is all the time that we have tonight. We're back again tomorrow with the latest in Texas politics. Until then, thanks for watching. Stay safe and have a great night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. And for more refreshing stories about your community, click the subscribe button right over here. You can also download our Spectrum News app to get live news coverage, weather alerts, and more wherever you are. And don't forget to tune in to Channel 55 on Dish and DirecTV for live local reporting every single day. We'll see you then.